it to the doing that.
We know the reason for that is
Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to this very exciting part of Lupin Fest 2024. My name is Jeff Corbin. I'm the president of the Friends of the Albany Pine Bush, and so I want to welcome you here to tonight's presentation. Before I do, just a few housekeeping items. First of all, if you didn't avail yourselves of a little bit of sugar or salt or water, drinks, please help yourself in the back. There are restrooms out the door and to your right. In the unlikely event that there's an alarm or something like that and we have to leave, you probably all came in that exit. There's another one out that way if we need it. If we do have to do that, let's all just gather in the front so we know that we're all here. So,
yes.
Aside from those not going to happen kinds of contingencies, let me also just say a little bit about the Friends of the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. So we are a nonprofit which is dedicated to helping the commission carry out its duties to manage this wonderful ecosystem, some of which you're going to hear about today, but also to be able to bring a wide range of the public and school groups and so forth here. So I hope all of you are already members. If you're not and you're interested, then I'll be more than happy. There are some of these forms with information back there. You can also go to the albanypinebush.org website and click on the Friends link, and you can contribute and join and sign up for our newsletter, join meetup hikes, all sorts of things like that. So now let me turn to what we're all really here for, and that is to introduce Neil Gifford, tonight's speaker. So Neil is the Albany Pine Bush's conservation director. He joined the staff in 1994 as a volunteer, and since 1997, he's been a full-time employee of the commission. He's a graduate of Paul Smith College in SUNY Plattsburgh, or Plattsburgh State University, I guess as it was then, where he received his master's degree studying the beautiful jack pine pavement barrens up in that area. He's authored a number of scientific and popular press articles about the science and the management of pine barrens and sand plains. He's a licensed U.S. Geological Survey master birder, and he's led and participated in several hundred prescribed burns, of course, here at the Pine Bush and in New York, but as far away as Florida and Illinois as well. Tonight we'll hear another one of his parts of his job, that he's a member of the state and federal recovery teams for the endangered Karner blue butterfly, which is the subject of tonight. So implication of climate change on Karner blue butterfly recovery in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. Please take it away, Neil.
Thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here in person this evening and joining us for our month-long festival to celebrate lupin and Karner blue butterflies. One day wasn't enough. We've had an annual Lupin Fest of one day for around the last 10 years or so. So this year we decided to make it a month-long series of activities. So I appreciate you all coming out, traveling from near and far to join us this evening. And to those of you at home online, thank you for joining us. So I am going to talk tonight about Karner blue butterflies and climate change. I'm going to start with some introductions and everyone may not be familiar with Karner blues and their biology. So I'm going to start there, look at our recovery strategies, and then talk about climate change and the implications that climate change has, not only on Karner blue butterflies, but on the pitch pine scrub oak barrens as well. My co-author in this presentation is Dr. Stephen Campbell, our conservation biologist, who is also joining us online this evening. And of course, there is the star of the show, a male Karner blue butterfly in a patch of high quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens with, if you're not familiar with wild blue lupin, there's a selfie stand behind us, but it's the beautiful wildflower in the middle of this slide. So a little bit about Karner blue butterflies. One, males and females look differently. So that animal on the upper left with that beautiful solid blue on the top of his wings, that's the male. The female is at the bottom down below, and she's more of a bluish brown. And in their short lifetime, an adult Karner blue butterfly lives 3 to 5 days, typically in the wild. She will fade and get increasingly brown to the point where she's almost faded to solid brown. And Karner blue butterflies are linked specifically to wild blue lupin because it is the only plant that the Karner blue butterfly caterpillars will eat. Karner blue caterpillars eat the leaves of wild blue lupin. And lupin is found really well, lupin is found far and wide, but Karner blue butterflies are relegated largely to two ecological community types. In the Northeast and in the upper Midwest, they're in pine barrens and oak pine savannas. And you can see the top photo there is a oak pine savanna in Michigan, and then of course the pitch pine scrub oak barrens here in Albany. And what do those ecosystem types have in common? A couple of things. Principally is their structure. While here it's an open overstory of pitch pine with that kind of that grassy shrubland beneath it of native grasses, wildflowers, and two species of scrub oak. In the upper Midwest, it's principally various species of oak and occasionally some red pine and some jack pine. So they're importantly similar in structure, and that's incredibly important for Karner blues because they are not a prairie animal, they are a savanna animal. And the poem I'm working on is called Wandering Shadows, because Karner blues and so many other of these species in these systems are, as you will see, are ultimately relying on that open structure and those traveling shadows over the course of the day to help buffer them from being overly exposed to the sun. Of course, adult butterflies can move to thermoregulate. Eggs, caterpillars, and pupa cannot. So those wandering shadows over the course of the day are critically important, and female Karner blues prefer to lay their eggs on partially shaded lupin. But besides the structure, what these ecosystem types have in common is wildland fire. And fire is critically important, not only to the ecosystem health, but also to specifically to Karner blue butterflies, because fire benefits lupin and lupin benefits the butterflies. So Karner blues are indirectly tied to wildland fire naturally. And I wanted to go over a little bit about the life history. So Karners overwinter as eggs. I don't know if everybody knew that, but Karners don't migrate. They don't go anywhere. Actually, they are real homebodies. As adults, like I said, they live 3 to 5 days. Most of them travel maybe 200 meters from the patch of lupin they hatched from. So those eggs hatch this time, hatch in April, early April. There should be lots of caterpillars out there now. We're in the middle of May, and adult butterflies should be closing any day. We expect emergence and start seeing our first Karners any day. And that's, you see that double hump in the inside of that circle. So adults come out in late May into June, live 3 to 5 days, mate, lay their eggs, and die. Those eggs hatch right away, become caterpillars that become butterflies in July into early August. Their eggs then overwinter, start the cycle all over again. Exactly how eggs know to hatch or not hatch, nobody knows. What we do know is that it's tied to photoperiod, like is the main thing for lots of wildlife, right? What is the main clock for wildlife? It's the sun. The first brood are hatching as the days are getting longer. The second brood are hatching after the solstice when the days are getting shorter. So it's interesting, and we think that is somehow what is keying the females into somehow putting a signature on those eggs to hatch or not hatch. But Karner blues are principally tied to those two ecosystems. Of course, we all know that Karner blue butterflies are endangered, and they're endangered with extinction for a variety of reasons that we're all probably far too familiar with. Of course, first and foremost is simply the loss of habitat. The pine bush in particular covered originally, the pine barrens here covered at least 25,000 acres. The preserve is currently 3,000 acres, 3,400 acres, and that's slightly more than half of the pine barrens that are left here. So habitat loss, that is Crossgates Mall there, and then you're looking at SUNY Albany. Both of those sites were developed on former Karner blue butterfly habitat, big, large sites that supported Karner blues. But it's not just habitat loss. Fragmentation is also essentially important. And habitat fragmentation for Karners is, of course, developed land and roads, but it's also forests. These are not closed canopy forest animals. They need that open canopy structure. So in that lower picture, they would move through those open fields and those openings in the forest, but they will not move through, around, or over closed canopy forest. And then, of course, degradation. It's not just that we've lost habitat, but we've also, in these ecosystems, been conditioned to suppress wildland fire for decades, since the early 1900s, and the federal 10 a.m. policy. All fires need to be extinguished by 10 a.m. the morning after they were found. That was federal policy. And fire suppression has done a number of things, but in particular for Karner blues, we lost all the open grassy shrublands we had. They filled in with a closed canopy thicket of scrub oak, which you're seeing in the top of that photograph. And when we initially started managing the pine barrens here, that was largely what we had left of high quality barrens. It wasn't actually barrens. There were very few acres of barrens. It was all pitch pine scrub oak thicket. And those thickets, you cannot get lupin, other wildflowers, and native grasses to grow underneath that closed canopy of scrub oak. Similarly, a lack of fire allowed more forest to develop here than had been here historically. And that's both native forest, but also, can't use the keyboard, Neil, but also invasive species. Quite literally, our biggest nemesis is black locust, a non-native invasive and clonal tree that rapidly outcompetes all the native pine barrens plants and replaces it with a forest type that not only replaces the plants, but it completely destroys the soil system that pitch pine scrub oak barrens need. In particular, nutrient cycling, and more importantly, the ectomycorrhizal fungi that oaks and pines need to survive in these sandy soils. So invasive species, in particular black locust, is a fundamental game changer. It is an ecosystem destroyer. And then, of course, more recently is climate change, which we'll talk more about in a minute, and we'll see that map again, so don't look too long. Oh, sorry, the mouse was slow to respond. So as a result of all of those factors, Karner blues were declared endangered with extinction. And that happened in New York State in 1977. And that's really critical to the story of the Albany Pine Bush, because the law that created the preserve and the commission in 1988 is all about pitch pine scrub oak barrens for its ecological, educational, and recreational benefits. Even though Karner blues were listed as endangered in 1977, and this is the type locality, or the very first place Karner blues were ever identified as a species, the law does not talk about any species at all, including Karner blues. They were listed federally as endangered with extinction throughout their range in 1992. But so we think about, and we often think about, when we hear that term, right, endangered with extinction, we think the Endangered Species Act is about arresting that extinction, which of course it is. But more importantly, what the Endangered Species Act does is it triggers a recovery process. The idea is not just to keep those species around, but try to build their populations back up to a point where they are no longer endangered or threatened with extinction. And that's been what has been a large part of my entire career here, has been working on both the state and the federal recovery teams, developing our local and state and national recovery plans for this species. So the federal recovery criteria for Karner blue butterflies to get them delisted is to restore one or more viable metapopulations in all of 13 recovery units throughout their historic range. Maybe if I don't know if I can use my mouse on there. So this lower map is showing you the historical range of the Karner blue in tan. And then you can see those stippled little polygons that are stitched across that map. Those are the federal recovery units. There are 13. So depending on where you are, those recovery units need one or more viable metapopulations in order to be considered recovered locally and nationally. And in the east, so principally, if you look at that map, those are the current recovery units, because that is where the Karner blue currently persists. But essentially, Karner blues are still found only in 4 states out of the roughly 15 that they used to be in. Principally in Wisconsin and Michigan, and then you have to come all the way here to New York. The federal recovery unit in New York is called Glacial Lake Albany. That was the glacial lake that was here right after the glacier receded. And within Glacial Lake Albany, the federal recovery plan says we need 3 viable metapopulations to be considered recovered. So if you look at the map on the right, now you can see the historical outline of Glacial Lake Albany running from roughly New Paltz area all the way up to Fort Edward. And within that glacial lake, if you look at that tan color, those are all the glacial outwash sands that were deposited from a wide variety of rivers flowing into Glacial Lake Albany that formed deltas. Of course, the glacier receded, the lake receded, exposing those sand deltas that subsequently supported a variety of ecological community types: oak pine savanna, successional northern sandplain grassland, pitch pine scrub oak barrens throughout what is now largely the Hudson Valley. And still to this day, if you drive the Northway or you drive all up to Fort Edward, you will see pitch pine and scattered scrub oak. This time of year, you can find lupin throughout that area, scattered here and there, and and important plants like butterfly milkweed. Now in New York State, the recovery criteria are a little different. In New York, because we have 4 remnant populations, DEC has decided that we want 4 viable populations in New York State to be considered for down or delisting. And within each of those, each meta population within New York needs to have at least 3,000 adult butterflies in 4 to 5 consecutive years, or 4 to 5 years. It needs to support at least 320 acres of suitable habitat. And suitable habitat we'll come to later. It needs to support at least 5 subpopulations. So the reason these are called meta populations is that it's actually not just one population, right? It's a population of populations, or a meta population. And those meta populations are made up of subpopulations that are connected in some way. And we'll come to that when we talk about, I'll talk about it now, which is why I put that fire picture in the middle. And each subpopulation needs to be connected to at least 2 others. So the reason that's important is because naturally fire would have burned in a mosaic. And you have patches on the landscape where patches of lupin burn, kill all the butterflies. No life stage of Karner blue butterflies can survive fire. Egg, larva, pupa, adult. Adults live 3 to 5 days. Yet, so no life stage can survive fire, yet they only live in pitch pine scrub oak barrens and oak savannas that burn on a frequency of like 3 to 5 years for any given spot. So this is why I love fire ecology. How is it that an animal that cannot survive fire in any life stage only lives in places that burn frequently? Because contrary to what we see today with the major wildfires out west and now in Canada again this year, when under the indigenous fire stewardship that maintained the North American landscape and these ecosystems for hundreds, if not thousands of years before Columbus discovered the North American continent, fire naturally was burning very frequently and lightly across the landscape, and you had patches that burned, kill all the butterflies. Lupin's a perennial, sprouts back up better than ever. We know from experiments in the lab, you feed Karner blue butterfly caterpillars lupin that sprout up after a fire, and those resulting females lay a lot more eggs, right? It's just like the way bison follow burns in the prairies to get better forage. It's more nutritious, and because the whole plant leaves out all at once again, a second time, in a growing season, it's more palatable. Defense chemicals that a plant produces are in response to herbivory. So as things nibble on a plant, it constantly is increasing the defense chemicals. When the plant flushes right back up after a fire, defense chemicals are at their lowest, nutrients are at their highest, and you see female fecundity, and we assume male fertility also increase. So you can actually grow the population of butterflies by burning sites. But naturally, fire would have burned in a mosaic. This patch burns, kills the butterflies. There are nearby patches that didn't burn. Butterflies surviving there then recolonize the patch that burned after the lupin comes back up, which is why we have a metapopulation, and why having those subpopulations connected in some way is critically important, and we'll talk more about that. But those are the recovery criteria. We frequently talk about the number of animals we need, but the reality is it's so much more than that. It's enough suitable habitat arranged in a certain way that's going to perpetuate the population in the long term. We're not, when it comes to wildlife conservation, and we're more concerned with populations than individuals. Yes, when animals become endangered, you really have to be concerned about individuals. But essentially in conservation, we're more concerned about managing for viable populations. And that's actually a growing season fire from last year here in the Albany Pine Bush when lupin was in bloom. So recovery starts with land protection, of course, for us. And we've been we're still adding land to the preserve. The preserve is not done yet. It's currently 3,400 acres, ultimately working toward a goal of 5,300 acres. But that's only the beginning. We purchase land from willing sellers, add it to the preserve, and then manage it using a variety of tools. Fire alone is not going to restore the habitat. If we've learned anything in 30 years, it's that. The restoration, just like if we're sick, the restoration phase of making an unhealthy ecosystem healthy is very heavy-handed, just like if you're significantly ill, COVID, the flu, what have you. What it takes to get you healthy again is very different than what it takes to keep you healthy if you are healthy. So we use a variety of mechanical, some chemical tools, and in conjunction with fire to turn these black locust clones and white pine oak forests where there used to be pine barrens back into either successional sandplain grasslands in the case of black locust, or pitch pine scrub oak barrens, which in their highest quality are really that grassy shrubland or shrubby grassland underneath that open canopy of pitch pine and some oak trees. And then we follow that up with planting. So when we remove black locust, there's really nothing native left. Occasionally a few oak trees and a few pitch pine trees, but essentially all the pine barren plants are gone. So in that case, we're seeding a nice seed mix of locally derived native grasses, wildflowers, as well as some scrub oak and some pitch pine seedlings. After fire in the barrens, all we're doing is going in and interseeding lupin. So we have that tractor that you see at the top. That is a Truax seed drill, a no-till seed drill. So we load that thing up with lupin seed. We collect a couple tons of lupin pods every year in the preserve, gives us a couple 100 pounds of lupin seeds to be able to plant. So in locust clones, we're planting a wide variety, the whole mix. In the black after burns, we're planting just lupin. Everything else seems to come back incredibly well, including the native grasses and many of the other wildflowers. But lupin does not seed bank, so we have to plant it. So we're planting locally derived lupin seed at 3 pounds of lupin per acre into these management units and getting that kind of response that you see on the left-hand side. And if you look at the map, when I started here in 19 whatever, there were 9 sites of Karner blue butterflies in the landscape that totaled about 13 acres. And can you see them on that map? They're really hard to see, but they're these little pink dots. There are a few of them. There are a couple up here. There's one over here in the power line at Willow Street, but few and far between. Then a patch down here by Crossgates that's still there. Today, sorry, this is in hectares because we frequently present this at science lectures. That's roughly 800 acres. So today we have roughly 800 acres of lupin that we've planted across the preserve. And that is what the map is showing you there with that greenish color. Those greenish colors represent all of the places we have interseeded lupin on the landscape. And one of the problems with having those really small patches of lupin left is that we created so much habitat on the landscape, not enough butterflies were finding those spots to jumpstart and found new populations. Turns out cardinal blues are a bit of a party animal. And I say that in that they like the company of other cardinal blue butterflies. So you can't just put a couple of cardinal blue butterflies into a 20-acre patch of lupin. They won't stay there if they're not finding enough of each other. So so in order to compensate for that, and of course our landscape is still pretty fragmented by human infrastructure as well as some forest. So we go out now during the first brood, catch 20 females, take them to the New Hampshire captive rearing facility where they have been raising cardinal blue butterflies for over a century. They've completely lost their metapopulation and reestablished it. They have a captive breeding lab. So we bring our 20 females there. They spend their life sadly inside a solo cup on a sprig of lupin. The eggs are harvested every day, and out of those females, we get several thousand cardinal blue butterfly eggs that they rear to the pupa. The pupa could then come back here, which you're seeing in the petri dishes there. And then in the animal care room back here, those pupa finish off and eclose in these little tents that we carry out into the habitat and release adult butterflies. And when you release, so by having the caterpillars in the lab, of course, we're freeing them from all of the pressures of being in the wild, disease, predation, insects, fungus, you name it. And an individual female that lays 200 eggs, we're getting roughly 200 pupa out of that. And that allowed us to jumpstart populations over the course of really roughly like 8 or 9 years to jumpstart new populations of cardinal blues in the preserve. And we released at all of these sites really once, all of that, and we would release 500 to 1,000 butterflies at a time. Not only did those populations take and become self-sufficient, but we did that, if you look, all across the map. And then as we kept restoring additional habitat nearby, the butterflies naturally colonized that on their own. We don't release butterflies anymore. We did in 2021 because this site way out in the westernmost part of the preserve was pretty far removed. And we figured the butterflies would have had to have gotten through some forest and fly into the wind. So we helped them. And that site now is also one of our biggest. But this is called a program of accelerated colonization. We accelerated the colonization of new habitat. Yeah.
Suli's always been known as a party school.
Yes. True story. So are our recovery efforts? Yep. Are our recovery efforts working? So we have enough suitable habitat. We now currently have about 800 acres, well over 300. Our population size relative to the state and federal recovery criteria needs to be over 3,000 in 4 or 5 years. and we need to have interconnected subpopulations. In order to determine that, we monitor butterflies. Simple question, how many butterflies do you have, is ridiculously difficult to come up with. So to do that, if you look at the large map on the right, you can see all those lupin polygons and then little blue polygons on top of that. Those are the areas we physically sample. Within those areas, we have straight line transects that our seasonal conservation staff sitting in the back of the room walk every 3 to 5 days. And they do that, it looks like they're walking a bit of a tightrope. It's called distance sampling. So they're carrying that tent pole that has tape on it in different distance bins. And as they walk the transect, they're recording all the butterflies they see in each of those distance categories every 3 to 5 days. As a result of that, we get raw counts, which are the number of butterflies they recorded on, which are those red X's. Now, because we know the distance, and there are assumptions and formulas involved with, you assume you're seeing 100% of what's there on the line, but as you get farther out away from the line, you're seeing less. So Steve is actually able to calculate that to come up with daily estimates of abundance. Those are the green dots. He then, using calculus and computer models, stitches those dots together and calculates the area under the curve to give us a population estimate for the whole brood. And that's as far as I'm going with the math. That's why I hired Steve. And this is what we have now. And this is all, the methods are all the same. Using distance over time. There's a couple of things on this graphic. The bars represent the area of suitable habitat that we're sampling. So as we created more habitat and restored more habitat in the landscape, there was more habitat to search, which is why the bars go up. And we've pretty much plateaued at what we can physically survey in a year. It's around 150 acres. Again, our area here is in hectares. But then superimposed on that, the red dots represent the first brood of butterflies, the peak number, or the whole number for the brood. The blue dots are the whole number for the second brood. Now, typically, the second brood in July tends to be 3 times larger than the first brood in May, because you don't have that whole overwintering cycle, which is a lot of mortality when those eggs sit out there all winter. But you can see that, except for when we don't. So again, using distance sampling, we know in 2007, we had several hundred butterflies in the areas we're counting. And then it got in 2013, we broke over that 3,000 butterfly recovery threshold, which is the dotted line, and have stayed well above that recovery threshold ever since. And on average, we're averaging, over 10,000 butterflies a year, just in the area we sample. And we'll come back to these green asterisks, but the first brood estimates for the last 2 years have not been reliable because butterflies were already flying when we got out there. And we'll come back to that when we talk about climate change in a sec. And I just important to remember that number, those numbers, 10, 14,000, over 45,000 in 2020. And that's a real number. If I had heard and read Nabokov's characterization of clouds of butterflies and walking through fields of lupin, for whatever reason, all the holes in the Swiss cheese lined up perfectly, and Karner blues were released, their reproductive potential was released from all the things that normally would suppress the population. And that's naturally what happens with insects. There are a variety of things over the course of the year that are suppressing population growth. And every once in a while, boom bust cycles. And every once in a while, they boom. And all those pressures are alleviated for whatever reason, and they can achieve their reproductive potential. And that's what happened in 2020. And it was insane. The number of butterflies, all of us agreed with COVID, we couldn't hire seasonals. So it was literally Steve, myself, our fire manager, and our former preserve ecologist sampling. And it was clouds of there were just butterflies everywhere. There's no way we counted everything that we were seeing when we were out there. So even that number is conservative. Then it came back down to reality in 2021, but it's maintaining itself. But importantly, that number only relates to those blue polygons that we're physically sampling. We don't know the actual number in the whole preserve. All we know is it's bigger than the 10 to 15,000 that we're calculating for the area we sample. The amount of while there's lupin in all of those green polygons on that map, the amount of lupin and the quality of the habitat is variable. But the number we're giving you is really conservative. But it's not just about numbers. It's also about subpopulations, and we have to create enough subpopulations. So now we have currently 8 in the preserve, and a 9th one that we're working on in the Schenectady Pine Barrens Preserve Complex in Schenectady County at the Woodlawn Preserve. We have restored over 20 acres of Karner blue butterfly habitat there, and we'll be working to reintroduce butterflies and create yet another subpopulation within their historic range in Schenectady County. And why are subpopulations important? Again, it's all about that connectivity, and that's what that graphic on the right is showing you. They have to be close enough that butterflies can move from one patch to another. But also, by having multiple subpopulations in the landscape, no one freak event is likely to wipe them out. When you only have, if all your eggs are in one basket, quite literally, and one wildfire comes through or one prescribed fire, right, it could kill them all. In this way, we have buffered the population from any one catastrophic event wiping them out. And this is what that looks like. We started off in 2007 with a small pie that only had 3 slices. And over the course of time, as we've done our work, we're now up to 8 or 9 slices and relatively well distributed between several of those subpopulations that are connected. That's ideal. Again, that repetition across the landscape is building resiliency into the metapopulation structure to ensure their continued survival. It's not just about the number of animals, it's also about how they're distributed on the landscape. And within those habitat areas, we're also sampling, for suitable habitat, and that means enough lupin. Suitable habitat contains at least 810 stems of lupin per acre. Lots of wildflowers for the adult butterflies and the appropriate structure. And what we're finding with our habitat monitoring is that lupin density is exceptionally high. Nectar species richness is also very high. Grass cover in some cases is too low and in some cases is too high. And one of the reasons why we're doing this is we're sampling Karner habitat at the same places we're sampling the butterfly numbers. And ultimately, we'll be marrying those two things together in computer models to try and figure out what is really driving population dynamics. But ultimately, this is where we are if you think about all of the viability criteria. So again, this is a TNC viability tool, but it looks at the size, condition, and landscape context of Karner blues. In this case, it could be pitch pine scrub oak barrens. That's what that book is about over there. So again, if it's good or better, it's more or less met or exceeded recovery thresholds. If it's less than good, it's not. So we currently we're exceeding the number of subpopulations in our metapopulation. We needed, this is my slide is old. We needed at least 5. We're currently at 8. The number of butterflies is very high, well above our target. The acres of suitable habitat is more than twice what the federal recovery plan said we needed. They came up with this interesting metric where in the Midwest, where they thought there was more land available, there are large viable populations of that contain at least 620 acres of lupin. But in the East, because we had small fragmented pieces, they said you only need viable populations. Now, biologically, viable is viable. It's either viable or it isn't. So we're happy to see that we have met the large viability criteria of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we have plenty, and our subpopulations are connected. And we're monitoring environmental variables, which is essential in understanding the abiotic factors that influence population growth and population dynamics. We have a weather station out here measuring temperature and rainfall, but then we have a phenomenal cadre of community scientists with these staff gauges in their backyards recording snowpack forests over the course of the summer. And ultimately, we'll be looking at all of that. But of course, those environmental factors are incredibly important, especially to insects. Insects are ultimately population growth in insects is largely responding to those abiotic environmental variables. And what we know is that we are not only currently in a biodiversity crisis, but we are also in a climate crisis. And this is showing, the fact is that the globe is getting warmer, right? And we talk about global warming and climate change. In reality, they're the same, but they're different, right? The whole planet's getting warmer. That's what this is showing us. But the reality of what that means at any given spot on the planet, that's climate change. Climate's going to change differently here than it is in Alaska, than it is in Africa. That's climate change. And in New York, I want to start you with this graphic on the left. This is out of the New York State's Observed and Projected Climate Change report that came out in 2021. It was an update to their earlier report. It is already, you can see the squiggly line in the lower left there. It's already obviously getting warmer. And whether it's the low emission standard or the high emission scenario, it is projected to increase, to continue to get warmer. And that's also illustrated more acutely in the upper middle there. The red graphic there is showing you the observed and projected increase in days exceeding 90 degrees for New York State. So we know it's getting warmer. It's also getting wetter. And if you look at the graphic in the middle there, the map of the United States, the Northeast in particular has already gotten wetter and is projected to get even more so moving forward. The problem with that is it also is meaning less, it's getting wetter, but it's also getting warmer. So we're getting less snow. And that's what this long skinny graphic of the Eastern US is showing you. And again, you have the lower emission scenario on the left, the higher one on the right. In the Northeast, the frequency of snow that's by month. So you're starting with, I know this is small, I think it's with October, November, December, January, February, and March. But it's showing you that the amount of snow we're getting is decreasing over time, which we have seen. So it's getting warmer, it's getting wetter. More of that water is coming as rain, not snow. And lastly, we know the growing season is getting longer. And the graphic on the far right is showing that I'm talking. It is showing that the last freeze of the spring is coming earlier and earlier, right? I could plant corn this year on May 10th. I would typically wait until Memorial Day. So the last freeze is coming earlier and earlier, and the first freeze in the fall is coming later and later. The growing season is getting longer. All of that together has huge implications on wildlife population dynamics that we're going to talk about in a second. But ultimately, also what we're seeing is an increasing frequency of increasingly severe stochastic events, weather events, whether it's rain events, whether it's wind events, droughts, right? Lake effect snows in particular. The Great Lakes now don't freeze over the way they used to, meaning that when that cold Arctic air does come rushing down out of Canada, it's coming across the Great Lakes and dumping lake effect snow on Western New York and occasionally coming all the way to Albany. And ultimately, all of those increasingly frequent severe events are also going to cost more money to deal with moving forward. So the climate is clearly changing. What does that mean locally? I just want to focus on I didn't put all the slides in, the same patterns happening here, wetter in particular. But the most interesting thing and the greatest implications for the preserve and the Karner blue is that winters are less cold. So this graphic is showing you by the 4 seasons, the average daily minimums, right? Those lows that the weathermen and ladies are reporting to us each day. And what's happening is, in particular in winter, if you look at the scale, winters are getting less cold. It's not so much, and if I showed you the highs, the slope is flatter. It's not so much that winters are getting warmer per se, the highs, but the lows are coming up. And that is having huge implications, especially for insects, especially for things like Karner blues that overwinter as eggs and are principally relying on snow cover to keep them protected from the elements, right? And for students on field trips, I liken it to, putting your egg salad sandwich in the fridge for 3 days or putting it on the counter for 3 days. Which one do you want to eat, right? So if it's in the fridge at a constant temperature and humidity under snow, it's more or less protected from mold and mildew and fungi and predation and all the rest. So the fact that the lows are coming up, that the floor is rising, is particularly problematic. The Federal Karner Butterfly Recovery Team has looked at this and just came out with this report in 2023, looking at Karner blues and their climate vulnerability. And I won't get into all of the jargon. It is a very long report, but ultimately what it is saying is that Karner blue butterflies are very exposed to climate change. They're highly sensitive to climate change, and they have a very low adaptive capacity. In other words, by themselves, they will not be able to adapt to the changes that are coming. And if anybody wants this, you can email me and I can forward you the link to that. I keep trying to use the keyboard when I know it's not working. But ultimately, what is that meaning for Karner blues? Ultimately, it's looking like it's going to mean this. This is demonstrating the climate footprint for Karner blues. So initially, this is done by the USGS and folks at the University of Notre Dame. The black dots on the upper graphic are the places Karner blue butterflies exist today. So what they did was they took all the environmental variables, plugged it into a computer model, and then tried to model where does that climate footprint happen today as a way of ground truthing Karner blue's current climate footprint. And it did a really nice job of demonstrating where Karners could be living today. That's the top. The bottom is showing, and this is under the lower climate change scenario of greenhouse gas emissions, It's showing you, again, where Karner blues are today are the black dots. And it's showing you the climate footprint for 2080. So the reality is the climate envelope for Karner blue butterflies is migrating north. Now, if you remember, I talked about the fact that Karner blue butterflies only live as an adults 3 to 5 days. So the eggs and the larva and the pupa are sessile, right? They just stay in one place. The adult butterflies can move and do a lot of research. At most, Karner blue butterflies through open habitat, like you saw in my photographs, or like that slide in the back, at most through open habitat, they'll move a kilometer. 80 some odd % of them never go more than 200 meters from the patch of lupin they hatched from. So their ability to move across the landscape is very, very low, which is why their adaptive capacity is very, very low. And before I move on, I want you to think about that for a second. So the map of Karner blue butterflies, where they are today and where they used to be. For Karner blues to be from Minnesota to southern Maine originally meant that there were habitats at one point on this landscape supporting lupin and an open canopied structure stitched across the landscape from Minnesota to Maine. It was not this Thoreauvian ideal, this European ideal of closed canopy, climax forests. The reality is that existed in spots, of course, on mountaintops and on hills and whatnot, and scattered about. But in the river valleys and the plains and on the side slopes of all those hills and mountains, there were a lot of open canopied habitats, like the remnants we see today of the oak savanna in the upper Midwest and pine barrens in the Northeast, right? There were grasslands, there were open oak woodlands, there were pine barrens, there were oak savanna. In order for Karner blues to adapt to climate change today, they would need that connectivity again across the landscape, stitching them to where, right, hopefully their habitat would move as climate change moves. That's what happened last time climate change happened. The problem now is the rate at which climate change is happening far exceeds the ability of plants and animals to adapt to it and move. And we're also in the way with our roads and our buildings and our highways and all this closed canopy forest and other types of habitats that they can neither live in nor move through. Which again is why Karner blues have a very low adaptive capacity. So what does that mean for us locally in managing Karner blue butterflies in the face of climate change? One of the things that sets the pine bush apart and unique from all the other pine barrens is this massive field of dunes that the pine bush sits on. If you look at the picture in the back, the hills that you see when you walk around here, if you remove the vegetation from this landscape, it would look like, if you've seen the new movie Dune, it looked like the Sahara Desert. It looked like, some of those scenes from Star Wars with the giant antlions in the pit. It's wind deposited sand. This is the largest field of inland sand dunes in eastern North America. That's not on the coast. That is what got the Albany Pine Bush its national natural landmark status. The dune field here is incredible. You can see it on the map there, all these horseshoe and J-shaped sand dunes, but those dunes create microtopography and microclimates. Think about it. If you take a flat sand plain that most pine barrens sit on, and then you wrinkle that thing, and now you have high and dry, low and more wet. You've got south-facing slopes that are more exposed to the sun, that are hotter and drier than north-facing slopes that are facing away from the sun, which are a little bit cooler and more moist. That microclimate heterogeneity in this landscape gives us the ability to try and buffer Karner blues and other insects from some of the short-term impacts of climate change. So taking advantage of that dune structure and getting lupin on north-facing slopes, historically lupin has predominantly been on south-facing slopes, is one of the ways that we're thinking about and already adapting our management strategies to try and build this metapopulation as big as possible to keep it here for as long as possible. And that's important because in order for Karners to move to new habitat in that future climate envelope that I showed you on the previous slide, we're going to need to move them. The same way I catch 20 butter females here in May, bring them to the New Hampshire breeding facility, get those pupa back, and then release thousands of butterflies here. If there are entities and partners to our north creating and restoring Karner habitat to our north, we can physically help them get into that habitat. It's going to require donor sites, and donor sites with strong genetic diversity, hopefully. So again, maintaining a very large metapopulation for as long as possible increases the probability of us being able to donate Karner butterflies to future habitat to our north. But think about that, because the reverse is also true. There are species to our south. If you look at, if you're familiar with pine ecosystems in the United States and North America, right? They function largely the same. All across the southeastern coastal plain, right? You got longleaf and shortleaf pine, other pine, pine oak savannas that are grassy shrublands underneath a very open overstory canopy. Same thing in on the Colorado Plateau with ponderosa pine. Very high frequency, a lot of grasses and wildflowers, very open. There are species to our south in those types of communities today that will likely need someplace to live in the future. So even if we lose Karner blues from here, managing for a healthy, resilient pitch pine scrub oak barrens ensures that this place will likely be a recipient site for some other species that currently is south of us that needs a place to go in the future. So we are also conscientiously thinking about that nationally and thinking about Karner blue butterfly recovery, but also locally with how we're managing this place. Why do we want, if the threshold is 3,000 butterflies a year, why do we keep planting more lupin? Because the bigger and larger this metapopulation is, the longer it's going to stick around, which means the higher the probability that there will be butterflies to move into future habitat. And if we have a large, healthy pitch pine scrub oak barrens that is resilient to climate change because we've managed it appropriately, keeping it diverse, maintaining low fuel loads, maintaining what mimics indigenous fire stewardship or indigenous fire keeping through a very high frequency, low intensity fire regime that doesn't allow dangerous accumulations of fuel to build up. So we end up with the major conflagrations you see in the news out west or in Canada. Increases the resiliency of this ecosystem to be a recipient site for species that live south of us today. But all of that means ultimately the next three bullets. We're shifting our strategy, we're shifting our thinking and how we're managing this place. We've gone through a major paradigm shift in just understanding what a healthy pitch pine scrub oak barrens is. From how we're managing this site today for that grassy shrubland is not what we envisioned 30 years ago when we started this project. It's what we've learned over the course of time through both our own research and management, but also listening to partners and academic partners like Jeff Corbin there. But ultimately, we're charged with restoring and maintaining a viable, resilient pitch pine scrub oak barrens, and that's our ultimate goal. Karner blues, the demise of the Karner blues here and on other places, their endangerment with extinction, was really a symptom of a much bigger problem about ecosystem health. And that is repeating itself currently south of us in Long Island as a result of warming that floor rising in the winter. A native bark beetle to the southeast, the southern pine beetle, has moved into overstocked, unhealthy, unmanaged pitch pine forests in New Jersey and Long Island and decimating tens to hundreds of acres in a single growing season. Because instead of an ecosystem that's open like this, there are too many pitch pine trees per acre. And based on the way the beetle functions, that is the ideal habitat for southern pine beetle to take over and outright kill tens to hundreds of acres in a single growing season. We have southern pine beetle here. The report I just got from DEC is because they're monitoring 20 sites across the state. We have southern pine beetles been here for almost a decade now, but they're not only catching southern pine beetles, they're catching other native bark beetles and native bark beetle predators. And they were happy to report that of any of the sites they're monitoring, we have the largest and most robust and most diverse population of native bark beetles, competitors for southern pine beetle and their predators. We do not anticipate southern pine beetle decimating our native pitch pine populations here the way they are in Long Island because of the way we've been managing this ecosystem for the last 30 years. The same story holds true with native bees. We have our 206 native species of bees here and hundreds of species of native moths. We were part of a regional study for both bees and moths. Same story. The diversity and abundance and health of those communities, the moth and bee communities, is huge compared to all the other sites. So what is the big take-home message? Ultimately, managing for a robust, large Karner blue butterfly population is our best insurance for an uncertain future. We know climate change is happening. Models are models. Models say Karner blue envelope is going to be north of us by 2080. The degree to which that is true, of course, is yet to be seen. One of the things, and that's why I had this slide up. One of the things that we have, one of the major paradigm shifts for me in thinking about how this ecosystem functions and how Karner blues function within it. I learned when I started that, right, the two broods and all of that for Karners, but that lupin is the first thing to come up in the spring. It blooms right now, and it's the first thing to die back in late June, early July. Yes, unless you burn it when it's already green. So that slide is showing you a management unit in Truax Trail Barrens that we burned in the growing season on May 20th when lupin was fully green. Cool thing was the lupin is so succulent, the larger patches don't burn because there's too much water. So even within the management unit, where typically we learned, like, if you burn an area that contains Karner blues, you're going to kill them all. So you've got to have areas nearby. So we planned on that with this 1/3 rule. We don't burn more than 1/3 of a subpopulation in a given year. We don't burn adjacent thirds in consecutive years to make sure there's always adequate refugia so that Karner blues can maintain their little dance with fire across the landscape through space and time. What we didn't anticipate is in the growing season, the places that did burn and lupin did burn, it sprouts back up right away, will reflower, and to make up for the loss, those plants stay green until killing frost in the fall, the same way lupin seedlings do. Now, if one of the impacts of climate change through other modeling in the lab, that we call them Karner blue torture chambers, but they were basically looking at the thermal limits of eggs, larvae, and pupa, and then modeling and trying to facilitate in the lab what happens in their variable warming scenarios. And one of the things they saw was that instead of 2 broods a year, with earlier and earlier springs, Karners emerge earlier, you can get 3, 4, 5, 6 broods in a year. The problem with that is by late July, August, September, there's no more lupin on the landscape. So if you are getting multiple broods beyond 2, even if you only get 3, and there's no lupin around, those any caterpillars that emerge out of those eggs have nothing to eat. However, when you're burning lupin in the growing season and maximizing the heterogeneity in the landscape, we've actually figured out with fire and with growing season fire, we can improve the availability and the nutritional quality of the lupin that's in the landscape. Again, buffering Karners and the metapopulation from some of these impacts of climate change. Yes, if you burn an area that contains Karner blues in the dormant season before things are green, everything in that management unit is all those Karners will be gone. Burning in the growing season, though, you get this really, especially in the maintenance phase, that when I was talking about the frequent light surface fires, you get this kind of a mosaic. And if you scan you with your eye through that burn, you'll see little islands of green scattered about. And that's ideal. We have refugia inside of a management unit that we burned, generating lupin that's actually helping population growth. And we know that based on experiments in the lab. When we fed Karner blue butterfly, caterpillars, lupin that sprouts right back up after the fire, those females laid more eggs that results in population growth. And when a PhD student modeled that out, the impact of this on population growth was profound. Well, nuts. So is that. Pardon me. So ultimately, the takeaway is a large, robust population is our best insurance for keeping Karner blues around long term. Well, I guess I dropped that slide. There was a math slide I had. So I'm going to come back to this, the green asterisks, which I mentioned earlier. One of the problems though with climate change and Karner blues coming out earlier in the way we manage and the way we monitor is that we're relying on frequently recent college graduates or young people that are still in school for a seasonal conservation science staff that count the butterflies. And what happened for the last 2 years is that by the time we got started in mid-May, butterflies were already flying. And if we don't have the beginning of the brood, the population estimates are unreliable because we can't fit that whole curve to the data. So, and that really changes Steve's ability, our ability to come up with a population estimate. So one of the things we have to think about is if Karner blues are coming out earlier and earlier, is somehow trying to start monitoring earlier, at least at some sites, to try and get the beginning of the brood so we know when they started, so we can fit the insect population curve to the data. Steve's watching, so I'm sure he'll have something to say about how I described that. I guess I'll leave it there, but in the short term, things are looking good. But in the longer term, thinking about climate change, the future is certainly uncertain. And our goal is to try and maximize this ecosystem's ability to support Karner blue butterflies and all of the other 113 rare wildlife species that need this habitat. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You said sometimes the grass, it's too long for them, too short. When it's too long, you mechanically
Well, it's more that it's too abundant. Some sites have way too much grass and not enough space for lupin, and other sites don't have enough grass.
When it's too long, too abundant, you cut it back mechanically or you just let it stay long?
We pretty much leave it long and leave the grass dense and try and, now that we have, 800 acres of Karner habitat on the landscape. Some sites have too much grass, some sites don't have enough, it all comes out in the wash. It's less of an issue today than it was when we had 9 sites and 13 acres of Karner habitat. The other thing that we've mitigated for is deer browse. When you have, 9 patches of lupin the size of this room, a couple of deer can wipe out the flowers in a couple of days. 800 acres, that's not happening anymore. We don't worry so much. When I first started, we were worried about deer and woodchucks and fencing lupin patches to keep things out. And today, that's not an issue at all. Browse really isn't an issue. In that case, the solution to pollution was dilution. Yes, ma'am.
The whole big footprint of, the SUNY, Nano and,
Crossgates Mall.
Crossgates, yeah.
Yep.
They all have these little dinky plants, these sort of planting, beds around the outside. Would it be helpful for them to include lupin in those?
Depends on, that would depend. We don't want to be pulling butterflies out into the parking lots and into the, around the buildings and under the lights when they've got the lights on all night long yeah. So it's a great thought, and native plant landscaping is really important in helping keep lots of insects around. In the case of Karners and lupin, it can be a double-edged sword. Yeah, that's a great thought. Good question. Next up, behind Crossgates, where there is habitat, yes. Planting lupin back there and blending the managed landscape into the natural landscape is what we're trying to do in places like that. Ren?
Are there any sites?
Yes. So the question, for those of you online, the question was, are there partners in sites north of us that we've started talking to and working with to thinking about moving Karner blue butterflies in the future? There are. So actually within New York State at the northern end of Glacial Lake Albany Recovery Unit, state parks protected and added 800 acres to the Moreau Lake State Park, right on it's called the Big Bend Preserve. It's on a big bend of the Hudson River. And their whole plan for that 800 acres is to restore and create an additional metapopulation of Karner blue butterflies. Further north than that, yes, with up Lake Champlain, there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of pitch pine. There's still lupin around the eastern shore of Lake Champlain, and even farther north into Canada. I don't remember what the federal entity in Canada is called, but they attend all of our US based federal recovery team meetings, and they're actively working on keeping a couple of similar species that they have. So frosted elfins and mottled dusky winged skippers, but they're aggressively working toward creating enough Karner blue butterfly habitat to reestablish Karner blue butterflies in southern Ontario. So it is happening. Those conversations have started. Yep. Great question.
Is there any benefit if you happen to have a place that has the sandy soil and everything that, like north of here to plant lupin seeds? I mean, would that be something someone
Yes.
might do?
Yes, that's important, even just for keeping lupin around. And like I said, lupin is still all the way up to the Canadian border, particularly in the Champlain Valley. Yes, whether or not the degree to which that would be valuable for Karners really depends on landscape context. And in particular, Karner blues need a lot of habitat. It's 320 acres is a viable population. So size. So ideally, if enough people did that, that could be phenomenal. So the question was, if people could plant lupin to our north, would that help? It would certainly help with lupin conservation. The degree to which it would help with Karner blues would depend. Jeff?
You mentioned skippers and elfins as other species that are relatively rare, and there are so many distinctive plants and animals here in the landscape.
Yeah.
The Karner's been a wonderful kind of anchor to allow you, I mean, it's protected because of that and all of your work. But if all of what's your worry about all of that attention of let's move Karners up, but we're not moving scrub oak, we're not moving spadefoot toad, we're not moving other things that may not have the federal designation at all.
Yep. So the question for those of you online was about all the attention on moving Karners north to keep them around without simultaneously thinking about other species that also need this habitat. So ultimately, your question gets at what we're trying to do here, which is not species-based conservation, but systems-based conservation. And ultimately, as I intimated earlier, the decline of the Karner blue was a symptom of a larger problem of ecosystem health in pitch pine scrub oak barrens here, oak savanna in the upper Midwest. So to your question, Jeff, yes, ideally, if folks were interested in Karner blue conservation long-term, we would be thinking about similar systems that can support them and some of these other species, but it is a real Pandora's box when you start moving species around. We have all kinds of, right? Think about invasive species today that come from other parts of the globe. Black locust comes from the southern United States. We have bittersweet from Asia. We have honeysuckles from Europe, right? So when these species move and are no longer contained by all of the things that naturally kept them in check, there can be a lot of unforeseen consequences. So we all of us in conservation, whether we're worried about species or not, should hopefully be thinking about functional systems. But the degree to which we move species around needs to be very carefully evaluated so that we don't end up doing more harm than good. Yeah, that's a great question. Anyone else? We are approaching the top of the hour. Wendy, I don't know if you can see a chat online, if we have any questions online.
Yep, you do. You have one question pending.
Okay, wait, go ahead. I can't see the chat.
The person wants to know, how difficult is it to grow lupin in residences in Guilderland? And would successful growing of this plant increase the butterfly populations?
So the answer to the second part of the question about growing lupin, yep. So the question was, how difficult is it to grow lupin in a residential area in Guilderland? And would that help Karner blue butterflies? Now, if you're in Guilderland near western, on the northern side of Guilderland, on sandy soil, it shouldn't be that difficult to grow lupin. Keeping it around with woodchucks and deer could be a problem if you only have a few plants. But growing the lupin itself isn't that difficult. The degree to which it would help Karner blues would really depend on, it would certainly help native pollinators. The degree to which it would help Karner blue butterflies would really depend on how close you are to a nearby colony of Karner blues and whether or not it was adding to an existing subpopulation. I talked about the minimum area for a whole meta population is 320 acres. The minimum area for a subpopulation is 12.5 acres, basically 5 hectares. So ideally, for a viable subpopulation of Karner blues, you would want to have, 12 acres, which is why the patch that we created in the Schenectady Pine Barrens Preserve is a little over 20, just so that it's big enough to actually support a self-sufficient subpopulation of Karner blues. That's a great question. And even if you can't grow lupin, all of us can do a lot to help our native environments wherever we are by landscaping with locally derived native plants. Whether you're in northern hardwood forest, whether you're in pitch pine scrub oak barrens, whether you're in up in Fort Edward in the grasslands, the more we don't use non-native invasive plants in our landscaping and use native plants, it helps native species. Wildflowers and grasses, of course, for pollinators, but even for birds. I'm very fond of birds. I love birds. It's what I study and spend most of my field time doing. But the best bird feeder for birds during the breeding season is a native tree or shrub, because that native tree or shrub is growing insects. And a lot of birds like chickadees for example, are eating seeds in the winter. It takes about 9,000 inchworms to raise a brood of chickadees in a season. So it takes an awful lot of little caterpillars, and oaks, cherries, and pines in particular are phenomenal native plants that feed native insects that are feeding all those birds we love seeing in our backyards. The rose-breasted grosbeaks, the orioles, everybody is eating insects to feed their young in the nest. They may eat other things at other times of the year, but their young are eating almost exclusively insects. And native plants are the best bird feeders because they're growing native insects for the birds to eat. Pammy, did you have a question?
A lot of people have been asking me that, and some people want to go to their local nursery and get lupin, which
Yeah.
is not wild blue lupin, and I heard that the non-native and like hybridized with the lupin and that's the wild.
I haven't heard, so the question is about lupin and planting Russell's hybrid or garden lupin at home and having that hybridized with native lupin?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know if it hybridizes. Almost anything can happen in a lab, I suppose. The bigger problem with the Russell with the garden lupin is it's actually like, you know, the old lupin lady and all that tall lupin, Mrs. Rumphius and all the lupin that's along the roadsides in New England, southern New England. It's become invasive to the point where the state of Maine and New Hampshire are actually trying to control it and eradicate it because it's out competing native plants. So yeah, Russell's hybrid, the garden lupin is beautiful, but unfortunately it too can be too much of a good thing. Yeah.
I just was wondering.
Yep.
I'm kind of worried like people are gonna plant but not.
Right. And it's much easier to grow and it will grow in more mesic soils with a lot more organic matter. Yeah.
And if there is that.
Yeah. Whenever you're trying to plant native plants, try and use, you know, locally derived genotypes or local cultivars that are still going to be more or less true to their natural form. Any other questions in the chat, Wendy? Because if
There'll be a native plant sale here on Saturday.
Yep.
at
native
10
plant sale here Saturday 10 to noon. Sandy, do you have a question?
Happen to be up at that's your park overlook. There's one from 10 to about noon,
Oh, beautiful.
wherever you are. And you also had inland, Aaron's buck moth here.
Yes.
And how does management, I mean, does that have any,
That's a great question. So, yep. So it's a great question because we're actually thinning scrub oak, right? Turning those thickets into open barrens means we're thinning scrub oak. We were concerned about that. So we worked with, the question was about inland barrens, buck moths and how they're doing with our management. And we're reducing scrub oak cover, which is the only thing the buck moth caterpillars feed on. We worked with SUNY ESF entomologist and two of his grad students studying that. And it turns out reducing scrub oak cover helped the local population of buck moths. They're doing fine. In particular, while the caterpillars eat exclusively scrub oak, and you might intuitively think, well, reducing scrub oak means less food, so less buck moths. The other life stage, when they pupate, is in the interstitial open space between the scrub oak. So the areas that we opened up and thinned that we now have lupin and grasses growing in are the places buck moth caterpillars are seeking out to pupate. So we actually have thinned the scrub oak to about 50% on average and not seen a dramatic decline in buck moth caterpillars because of that. And what he thinks was happening historically, we were seeing tons of late instar caterpillars on the trails because they were seeking out that microclimate where it was open. So by creating all that interstitial space across the barrens, we're still providing for their needs. It's a great question. Yes. Yes.
We've also now got it working with bagua,
Wonderful.
which finally a couple of years ago that endangered.
Yes, we're finally listed as endangered, which,
One
right,
of-
white.
one of 300 acre site.
Yep.
Period.
All right, well, we are over our time for the webinar. So Wendy, I'm gonna let you close that. For those of you in the room, I'm happy to stick around for a couple of minutes to talk to you, but we are anxious to get out and try and catch some eastern whippoorwills, which have moved back into this landscape after 30 years of being gone. So we can fit them with GPS tags and track how they're utilizing the managed preserve. But I want to thank you all for coming
Thank you.
here and thank you all online.
You need to send me that report.